Welcome to Grow Money Business, the podcast dedicated to helping business owners grow both their wealth and business on their own terms. Here's your host, Grant Bledsoe.
Hello, everybody. Grant Bledsoe here. Welcome back to Grow Money Business. This week on the show, we're talking about the debt ceiling. You may have seen or read or heard in the news recently that we have reached the limit written into law of the total amount of debt that the U.S. government may have outstanding at any one time. And that if we don't come to an agreement soon, we're going to run out of money, and that would have catastrophic economic effects. Well, this week on the show, we're going to talk about everything debt ceiling, including the history of it, why it's there, why it's a self-imposed and kind of fake limit in the first place, and what the real impact would be on the economy here locally and across the world if we were not able to come to an agreement and raise the debt ceiling and borrow more money and ran out of cash to make payroll for federal workers and fund Medicare and make interest payments on bonds and all of that fun stuff. So this was an interesting one. I do have a couple of takes on it. It's been a while since I've thought about this topic specifically, but I hope you bear with me and I hope you enjoy it. Hey everyone, I need to interject quickly to remind you all that nothing found in today's episode or any other episode of Grow Money Business should be considered financial, investing, legal, tax, fitness, or even relationship advice. It's content that you're free to use and to deploy on your own terms. And before taking any actions on content found on the show, please do consult with your tax professional, your attorney, or your financial planner. If you don't have a financial planner, head on over to threeoakswealth.com to learn more about what we do in terms of financial planning and investments and how we help clients on an ongoing basis. All right. This week on the show, I'd like to talk about the debt ceiling. The debt ceiling has made its way into the news cycle quite a bit here recently. We are, I believe we've reached the federal debt limit and are taking quote-unquote extraordinary measures, is what the news outlets are saying, to pay our bills at the federal level. And we will quickly run out of money here in the next 6 or 8 weeks if the debt ceiling is not raised. So this is a topic that's kind of hotly debated for a number of reasons. I've got a couple of takes on it, but I wanted to spend some time in today's episode just walking through what the debt ceiling is, why we have it in the first place, why this issue comes up, and what the impact would be if our politicians were not able to come to some kind of agreement. So, to be clear, this is certainly an issue. It would be bad for everybody. It would be bad for you and me and the other citizens of the United States, and it would be bad for the global economy if our federal government did not raise the debt ceiling. But I don't know that it's quite as bad as the hyperbolic language coming out of politicians' news conferences and your media outlet of choice would have you believe. So I've put some deep thought into this issue over the years. I've not put a whole lot of super deep thought into this more recently in the last couple weeks or months. And so I've tried to organize my thoughts for today's episode into a logical format. I do have some notes I'm kind of glancing at on my other screen right now to refresh my memory on what I want to cover. But I'm not super organized for today. So bear with me if I tend to jump around a little bit. But the debt ceiling is kind of an interesting animal because we're one of the few countries that actually has one. Most countries don't have a debt ceiling at all. There is no legal imposition on their government to go out and borrow money. And I don't know the exact reason why there. I would guess and suspect that a lot of countries around the world have more autocratic systems of government and more centralized power. And if you're the king of a nation or the queen of a nation and you have total authority, it makes absolutely no sense to write into law any self-imposed limit on borrowing money. You probably want to just do whatever you want. So that's one reason. Another reason is that this limit that we have is it's totally self-imposed, and it's just an artificial limit. It's very arbitrary, and the genesis of it goes back to 1917, when we were organizing and moving toward entering World War I. The politicians passed a law to impose this debt ceiling to promote fiscal responsibility. And I don't know the exact story around that. All I know is that it was related to spending around World War I, because we were trying to arm ourselves and really spending a lot of money, and that had people fearful for the long-term stability of the federal government. Now, since then, so we put this ceiling into place, and since then we've had to raise it anytime we've bumped up against that limit. So think of it this way. You have your balance sheet, you have your income statement for any household, any business, and any government. Same thing. So on your income statement, on your household budget, if you take in $100,000 a year and you spend $120,000 a year, then that $20,000 difference has to come from somewhere, and it impacts your balance sheet. So it's either, if you have cash in the bank, the $20,000 is being taken away from the available cash that you have. If you don't have any cash in the bank, it goes on credit cards and you borrow it, right? So for a household, it's imperative that you spend a little bit less than you earn, so you don't have that problem. So you have more cash coming in than is going out, so you can build an emergency fund and not take on credit card debt and have some extra cash left over to put in retirement and pay for the kids' college, or maybe pay down debt more aggressively, whatever you want to do. That's sound decision making and very logical for a household. For governments, for countries, the logic is totally different. It is healthy for a government to spend more than it earns, not a ton more than it earns. And there are limits on this. We want to be responsible, but it is actually beneficial for a government to spend a little bit more than it's taking in tax receipts and from other means. And the main reason is that you and I have a limited time on this earth, 75, 80, 90 years, whatever. The U.S. government and our country has been around for a lot longer than that, and hopefully will continue to be around for much, much longer. So if the federal government can go out and borrow money that it doesn't have by issuing U.S. Treasury bonds, it takes in cash. So it's issuing these bonds as an IOU, a promise to pay back later, for, let's call it $100 million. And they take in exchange for 100 million US dollars that it takes in from investors. If our government can use that $100 million in a way that's productive to the economy and grow GDP, gross domestic product, the total value of the goods and services that our country produces every single year, by more than the cost of that debt, then it's good for them to borrow the money and do that. And so some examples of that are if they borrow the money and improve the road system or the education system, or maybe they put in federal Wi-Fi around the country or something like that. Those are all programs that could potentially be beneficial to the country and increase production, because it's just improving infrastructure and will be economically beneficial, more so in a way that exceeds the cost of that debt, right? So on an annual basis, you and I know that we're spending more money than we're taking in, and especially over the last few years, we've been spending a lot more money than we're taking in through all the COVID stimulus and those kinds of programs. Now, there's a big question going on right now alongside this of how long can we continue to do this for? How long can we add to our national debt until we run into problems? And all of a sudden it becomes challenging for us to service the debt. All of a sudden the rest of the world loses faith in the US dollar, and we start to lose our exorbitant privilege of having the world's reserve currency. What are those limits? We're a ways off from that, to be clear, but we also have this arbitrary debt ceiling issue to run into that we're dealing with. So my view on this, to be totally clear, is that the debt ceiling should just be removed. And this is a political issue for a lot of people. I'm not a terribly political person. Personally, I'm probably pretty liberal socially and maybe a little bit more conservative economically. I want what's good economically for our country and everybody who lives in it, and myself, my family, of course. But this self-imposed limit is kind of silly these days. So since 1917, every time, let me back up. See, I told you I was a little disorganized today. So we enact this debt limit in 1917 because people are concerned that we're spending more than we're taking in tax receipts. And so every single year, and I don't know that every single year we've been in a budget deficit, but the level of federal debt grew after 1917. We were spending a little bit more than we were taking in every year from revenues. And that's, by and large, that's a good thing for any government and any economy if the dollars are used productively. So we added a little bit to our total debt level every year that we did that. The total level of national debt grew and grew and grew and grew and grew. And at some point, we hit that ceiling that was written into law in 1917. And so at that point, politicians had to get together and pass a bill to amend and raise the debt ceiling. What happens thereafter? Our habits, our spending doesn't just change overnight because now we can borrow a lot more money. We keep doing the exact same stuff we were before. We borrow a little bit every single year, spend a little bit more than we earn, and a few years down the road, then we bump up against that ceiling again. So it was a relatively straightforward thing politically, as I understand it. If I haven't read the history on this and wasn't around back then in the 60s and 70s, but it wasn't as big a political deal then as it is now to raise the debt ceiling. And as the temperature in Washington has gone up, there's a lot more rancor around this issue, right? If there's 100 of us, that's two of us representing each of the 50 states in a room in the Senate, and we are wanting to get stuff done for our state and for our party. In order to do that, we're going to have to give up a lot of favors. And so it's become so political where anytime we need to raise the debt ceiling, one party or the other holds our federal debt hostage in order to advance their political agenda. And that's, I mean, it's a logical thing to do. It's a rational thing to do. If you're in that position, you can get as angry as you want over it, regardless of what side of the spectrum that you're on. But it's a situation where there are certainly economic consequences if we're not able to raise the debt ceiling because both sides are digging their heels in and are unwilling to come to the negotiating table. So where we're at right now, and I'm recording this kind of toward the end of the week, and the last headline that I saw was that the House passed a bill to raise the debt ceiling. And the House is Republican controlled, the Senate is Democratic controlled, and the vote in the House ran along party lines. So the Republicans passed a bill that incorporated their agenda. It's a non-starter in the Senate. They'll vote it down because they're democratically controlled. But the output here is McCarthy, who is the Speaker of the House right now, of course, is communicating that he's hoping that this will bring the Democrats to the table and they'll be able to negotiate. So who knows? Maybe we'll get there before we run out of money in June. Maybe we won't. But where we're at right now is we've reached that federal debt limit. So we're not able to take on any more debt at the federal level right now. And we're able to fund our federal government's operations by what they're calling accounting gimmicks. Basically, they can move some stuff around that they have on the federal government's balance sheet to pay everybody for the time being. But what Janet Yellen is saying, who's the Secretary Treasurer, is Treasury Secretary, Secretary Treasurer, is that we will run out of money in June. So what happens when we run out of money, and how bad might that be? Well, a couple things that we need to be cognizant of. We, by law, cannot borrow any more money until that ceiling is raised. But we also, by law, cannot stop making payments on our entitlements and other obligations. So we're required to continue making interest payments. There's no discretion in the Treasury to pay this person and not that person. They're legally required to make interest payments on outstanding debt. They're legally required to cut Social Security checks for everybody who's receiving money from that system. They're legally required to fund Medicare and Medicaid and all that stuff. Now, if we hit June without an agreement, then we're not going to have the cash to make those payments, clearly. And that's bad. And if you think back to a couple of years ago when some of the last time that we had this situation, there were a bunch of federal workers who were sequestered and furloughed because we didn't have the cash to make payroll. And so they were laid off temporarily. And then they came back once they reached an agreement thereafter. So federal workers would be laid off. Not good for the federal workers. They don't have money coming in to pay their bills. Not good for the economy in general, because those federal workers who don't have income coming in anymore don't have cash to buy stuff from their grocery store. They don't have cash to go eat at local bars and restaurants. All those, all of that economic flow goes a lot slower. You have more people unemployed. So unemployment goes up. You have people who are relying on Social Security checks to live and VA payments and that kind of stuff. That slows too. And so the interesting thing here is, if all that stuff happens and we no longer make payments on U.S. government bonds, which is one of the areas that we're one of the payments we're required to make at the federal level, those bonds technically default. If you miss an interest payment, it's in default. So you would expect the value in the marketplace of a U.S. government bond to go through the floor and have all these long-standing consequences, right? Well, if the U.S. government can't make its payments, why would I don't think that a corporate bond could pay, or a corporation could make its interest payments on its bonds either. Maybe the value of that bond falls. Well, if the U.S. can't do it, why? What about England and France and all the other governments who have outstanding bonds in the marketplace? Wouldn't those fall in value? Well, we actually have some historical precedent here. And in 2011, we were bumping up against the debt ceiling, and that was not good for the markets temporarily. But bondholders knew that the U.S. government is going to have to continue to exist, and they're legally required to make all their back interest payments. And if we do default and we miss an interest payment, that interest payment doesn't just go away, it just accrues. Just like interest accrues on student loans if you don't make payments on your student loans. The U.S. government has outstanding debt, and if they don't pay the interest on it, it just gets added and it has to be paid back later. Okay? So the history on this is when it happened last time in 2011, interest payments were missed. U.S. government bond yields actually went down. You would expect if in a default situation that the yield on these things would go way, 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 way up, because in the marketplace, you would expect that if the U.S. government wants to borrow money, investors are going to require a lot more interest on those bonds because they just defaulted on some outstanding debt by virtue of this debt ceiling. And the exact opposite happened. The yields went down and the values of U.S. government bonds actually went up. And it totally defies logic, but kind of tells you that this is a self-imposed and fake limit in the first place. So there are, and to be totally clear, I'm not saying that this is a complete farce and is not something that we should pay attention to, and it would not have an impact on the economy. It absolutely would, right? If people aren't getting their Social Security checks, if government workers are laid off, that's bad. We don't like that. But this focus on the value of U.S. government debt and are putting the U.S. dollar in jeopardy as the world's reserve currency, that is far overblown. And again, back in 2011, the value of U.S. bonds actually went up throughout all this. The credit rating agencies downgraded U.S. debt during that time period as well. And they did what they should have. The bonds were in default, and so they downgraded the debt. Any other circumstance, if that were a corporation, the value of the bonds would absolutely go down. But the U.S. government has discretion over the currency that its bonds are denominated in. And so as soon as we get past this silly debt ceiling issue and work our way out of the political entanglement, the rest of the world knows that we have the ability to print as much money as we want. And it's not the Federal Reserve, running some big machine, printing a whole bunch of $100 bills and then dropping them from a helicopter or anything like that. It's by issuing these bonds and buying outstanding debt in exchange for dollars that are produced through the banking system. So there are a variety of ways that we produce money, but this self-imposed limit is kind of silly when you think about it from that perspective. Because the last time that we really ran up against it and passed the limit and had to start furloughing our government employees, the last time this was really in jeopardy, the rest of the world basically called our bluff and knew that it wasn't a legitimate threat. And the value of the U.S. government bonds actually went up. So that's the back to front of it at this point. Right now, there's a lot of arguing. You're hearing a lot of hyperbolic statements from the media outlets and from your local federal politician. And I think a lot of that is just a little bit overplayed. Clearly, there are ramifications here that are not good. Yields maybe they fall again, maybe they rise. But if interest rates go up, that means that the rates on other debts are also going to go up. So your mortgages, it would cost more to buy a house, credit cards, which is not good for consumers and the economy in general, and auto loans. And that's a pretty big driver of the economy. So it's kind of an interesting conundrum. I talked a couple episodes back about the U.S. dollar as the reserve currency, and again, we just have a lot of latitude there. And I'm not suggesting that we use that frivolously. I'm not suggesting that we go out and spend frivolously. I'm actually on the other side of the coin. But historically, since we have expanded the level of national debt, our GDP as a country has gone up just exponentially. And so over the last 100 years, our federal debt has actually been beneficial. And if it's a choice of should we have worked with a balanced federal budget every single year and only spent every dollar that came in through tax revenues without borrowing anything, if that's one option, and the other option is where we stand right now, where we have big budget deficits and a whole lot of outstanding debt that a lot of people are freaked out about, I would take our current situation every single time. Because even though there's a lot of fraud in loose money, you think back to the Paycheck Protection loans, Paycheck Protection Program loans from a couple of years ago. People were taking out fake loans and using the cash to go buy Ferraris and that kind of stuff. That's clearly not good and an abuse of the system. And there are issues with taking on debt and the level of interest payments that we have to make over time. But even despite all of the bad side effects of the debt level being where it is today, the magnitude by which our economy has grown and has continued to be the world's leading economic power over that same time frame easily justifies all that bad stuff and the poor side effects, because the good side effects are just so much larger. And I mean, the U.S. has been and is going to continue to be the world's most dominant economy, the most diverse and resilient economy in the world. And we might lose that status at some point. But I think the stats that I was rattling off here a couple weeks ago were that something like 60 to 75% of all the world's trade, or maybe that might be a little bit high, but 50 or 60% of all the world's trade, every transaction across the world where there's goods and services exchanged for some kind of currency is in US dollars. That's South Africa trading with Australia. That's Japan buying and selling stuff with South Korea. That's everything. Half of it is occurring in US dollars because of the stability we have here in the US economy, and because other countries around the world want to sell to our consumers and our government and our country. Because we have the biggest economy, because we have been productive with the debt that we've taken on, other countries want to tap our market. They want to sell to us. And so they want to hold US dollars. And that makes for that's a very good thing for our economy and citizens of the US in general. So we're a long way off. And I encourage everybody to listen back a couple episodes, because I was far more articulate and made better points about our status as the world's reserve currency and why I think we'll continue to be why I think we'll continue to have the world's leading reserve currency, hopefully for the rest of my lifetime. But as far as the debt ceiling goes, there are bad economic consequences here, but it is a self-imposed limit. This is not a situation where prudent, well, let me put it this way. This isn't a situation where we absolutely had to cap our spending because it was running out of control. It may have been a good decision at the time to impose this debt ceiling, because we didn't really know that much about operating as a fiat currency at that time. We were still on the gold standard back in 1917, and I can see why we would want to have tight controls over that. But since then, there's no gold backing the US dollar. We know that we have a little bit more latitude with the level of national debt that we have. And while I don't think that we need to spend unabated and expand the level of federal debt in a huge way, I think in large part history has shown that it's beneficial for our economy, and we have a pretty good track record of borrowing in a way that's productive for the economy. So I'm of the opinion personally that the relevant factor here is debt to GDP. For someone who's focused on, well, we have $30 trillion of U.S. government debt. I can't, that number is so large, I can't even fathom it. My kids are going to have to pay it off. I don't feel good about that. I think we need to control our spending and be good responsible stewards of the U.S. dollar and just fiscally responsible in general. We need to pay down the debts. I don't think we need to pay down the debts because our GDP is continuing to grow and enables us to continue to pay off the debts or make interest payments on the debts, I should say. That can continue. It's so easy to relate our household finances and use that as a metaphor for fiscal policy in our federal government, but it's not an apples to apples analogy. It's absolutely apples to oranges. In our households, we should be spending less than we earn. Maybe there is an argument out there if you're terminally ill or something like that. There are not very many good reasons to spend more than you're taking in. The federal government can do that. It's a going concern. It's going to be around a lot longer than you or I will. And it's a completely different situation and set of economic principles that governments deal with. So as long as the additional debt we're taking on is used productively, and I'm not saying that all of our debt has been used productively in the past. I'm saying on the whole, in sum, net, it has been productive. As long as on the whole, it can continue to be productive, it's a good thing that we raised the ceiling. Realistically, I think we ought to get rid of it entirely because it opens the door for this political nonsense and gamesmanship. And to be totally frank, I think if I were running the Treasury or I had any decision-making power over this stuff, we'd continue to spend some money, but a lot of the entitlements, a lot of the federal budget would need to be cut and maybe pivoted into more productive measures. And ask me what those are. I couldn't articulate them for you, to be honest, but our entitlement systems are not set up in a terribly productive way. So I got off on a little bit of a tangent there, but as I promised, I was not terribly organized today. So I hope this made sense. The debt ceiling is an issue. It has bad economic impacts if we're not able to take in more money and make payments on debts and cut Social Security checks and make payroll to federal workers and so forth. But it's a self-imposed and kind of fake limit. And what we've seen over time is that the value of U.S. government bonds the last time this happened actually went up when we surpassed the debt ceiling without coming to some kind of political resolution. So there you have it. June is the drop dead date where we will run out of money and have to furlough people or do something else. If I had to guess, I would say we'll probably come to an agreement before then because that's usually what happens. This happens every couple of years. But who knows? I could be wrong. I've been wrong before and I'll be wrong again. That I can assure you. So I hope this was interesting and I'll talk to you all again soon.
Thanks for tuning in to Grow Money Business, the podcast dedicated to helping business owners grow both their wealth and business on their own terms. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Google Play, or wherever you digest podcasts to ensure you don't miss out on future episodes and announcements. And feel free to submit questions to growmoneybusiness.com.